Apart from maybe Cleopatra, Tutankhamen is probably the most famous ruler in Egypt's history, which is amazing considering he died at 18 years old, only ruled for 9 years, and had no heirs ascend to the throne. Most people have heard of King Tut and have seen his burial mask, but might not know what he actually accomplished as pharaoh, who he really was, what he did, and what is his legacy. Well, let's start with a quick recap of why he's so famous in modern times. Right around 100 years ago in 1922, his tomb was uncovered by British archaeologist Howard Carter and his team. Before 1922, a businessman by the name of Theodore Davis had the rights to excavate the Valley of Kings, and he had unearthed a few artifacts that made reference to Tutankhamen, and they believed that the chamber they were in was his tomb. However, a few years later, it was Carter who would discover his actual tomb. The reason it had been hidden so well is because after Tutankhamen had been buried, his tomb was further buried by the debris of another tomb constructed 150 years after his death. What made his tomb so significant is that it was found in near perfect condition, containing over 5,000 items. It took nearly a decade to catalog all of the items in his tomb. It was and still is the most intact pharaoh tomb ever unearthed. This discovery is part of the reason ancient Egypt is so ingrained in modern culture. Many of the things that stemmed from this discovery became tropes in pop culture. There was even a rumor of a curse, not to mention the actual historic and archaeological importance. So that's why he's known today. A combination of sensationalism and actual importance. Chiefly of which is the incredible condition the tomb was in. If not for the condition of the tomb, it's most likely no one apart from Egyptologists would have ever heard or cared about King Tut. Why? Because his rule was so short. He didn't have time to achieve anything of major historical significance. He didn't even have time to finish his own tomb. The tomb he was buried in had been made for someone else because the tomb he had commissioned wasn't finished at the time of his death. This isn't to say he was without accomplishment, which is what this video is about. If we remove the sensationalism around his death, what kind of person and ruler was he? You see, in a lot of ways, Egypt was in a weakened state after the rule of his predecessor, Akhenaten. Economically, spiritually, and militarily, a lot of what Tutankhamen did could be categorized as a restoration. Akhenaten had moved Egypt away from its old religious identities. He preferred a more monotheistic belief system. He instituted Aten, who was the manifestation of Ra, as the supreme deity. This was a very radical and drastic change. As a result, many temples of other gods fell into disrepair. Tutankhamen undid all of that. Once he was in charge, he did away with any kind of monotheism and restored the previous pantheon. As such, he instituted policies to restore old temples as well as build new ones. He felt that temples were of important religious and cultural significance and wanted both to be restored in the present as well as in the future. He prioritized art that closely associated the pharaoh with gods in order to restore the idea that pharaohs were in fact deities. It wasn't just temples and theology he was working on either. He was also focused on heavily restoring and construction of infrastructure, including new roads, new government buildings, and new water canals. At the time, Nubia had moved away from being under Egypt's control, which was a problem for Egypt because of Nubia's great amounts of gold resources. Tutankhamen attempted to re-establish relations through trade, but that broke down and eventually led to a direct conflict that was a success for Egypt. Despite his short reign, he was able to notch victories in each column of Egypt's struggles at that time. That's what he did as a king, but what was he like as a man? Well, it is believed that he had a myriad of health problems. He had bone necrosis, which is when your bone tissue dies because of an interruption in your blood supply. He had scoliosis, which is when your spine curves unnaturally. It is theorized he had gynecomastia, which is a non-cancerous enlargement of male breast tissue, and he may have had an intellectual disability. We actually don't have time to go into all the possible health issues he had, including contracting more than one kind of malaria. Perhaps one explanation of his host of health issues is the fact that he and his whole family was incredibly inbred. His parents were blood siblings, and he even married his blood half-sister. Perhaps that could also explain why his 2 children didn't survive. One child was born prematurely, and the other didn't survive birth or died soon after. The cause of his death is unknown. Some think there was foul play, but there is little to no evidence that supports this idea. The leading thought is that he died due to a combination of a broken leg and health complications due to malaria. All the evidence suggests his death was quite sudden and unexpected. His death was the end of his royal line as he produced no heirs. Historically speaking, his time as pharaoh was of no real consequence, a true footnote in the Book of Pharaohs. Ironically, his accomplishments in life made him one of the least known pharaohs, but in death, he has become one of the most famous pharaohs of all time. There is so much more about him that we aren't able to cover in this video, but if you want to learn more, we encourage you to start with the articles we used in the making of this video, all of which are linked in the description. And if you want to be first in line next time we serve up a tasty knowledge burger, be sure to hit subscribe.